Okay, so welcome to our Ethics Center panel discussion. This is Confronting Injustice, the Ethics and Politics of Undergraduate Research in the San Joaquin Valley. I'm Andrew Fiala, and I am the director of the Ethics Center here at Fresno State and a philosophy professor. This event is part of our regular lecture series. Every year, the Ethics Center does a dozen or so events like this, panel discussions, interviews, lectures. And the goal of all of this is to inspire critical thinking, civil discourse, to provide students in the community an opportunity to think and challenge themselves about ethical issues. So I'd like to thank the Fresno State Alumni Association for helping us set up the Zoom for this. And then Ben Cruz, who is our student assistant this semester, I'd also like to thank him. He's been doing a lot of hard work this semester on these events. And I'd like to begin with the land acknowledgement. Fresno State campus sits in the midst of the San Joaquin Valley, a valley rich in the traditions and representation of Native American peoples and cultures. We're grateful to be in the traditional homelands of the Yokuts and Mono peoples, whose diverse tribal communities share stewardship over this land. So our panelists today are Dr. Daniel O'Connell and Dr. Scott Peters. They'll speak for about 30 to 40 minutes. We'll see how it goes. And then we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion. So for that part of the webinar, we want to use the Q&A feature. So feel free to post questions to the Q&A. I'll try to help moderate that a little bit. I just want to remind everyone that we're going to practice our best behavior of civil discourse here. And even if we disagree about stuff, let's disagree in a reasonable and respectful way. But it's okay if we disagree. So I actually was talking with Scott and Daniel earlier, and they said, let's get some provocative questions. So I challenged the audience to challenge them and ask them some tough but respectful questions. So I'll introduce both of them and then I'll get out of the way. So Daniel O'Connell, who I've gotten to know through the last couple of years in our work together in the Human Rights Coalition of Central California and a couple of other projects. Daniel's the executive director of the Central Valley Partnership, a regional nonprofit organization and progressive network of labor unions, environmental organizations, and community groups spanning the San Joaquin Valley. Trained as a multidisciplinary ethnographer, he holds an MS in International Agricultural Development from UC Davis and a PhD in education from Cornell University. As a politically engaged scholar, his work is dedicated to achieving social, racial, environmental, and economic justice in California. And sitting next to him, it's cool to have them both on the same camera. Sitting next to him is Scott Peters, who is a professor in the Department of Global Development at Cornell University and a historian of American higher education's public purpose and work. He has spent the past 20 years as a leader in the civic engagement movement in American higher ed, most recently serving as faculty co-director of a project called Imagining America, Artists and Scholars in Public Life. He is the lead author of Democracy in Higher Education, subtitled Traditions and Stories of Civic Engagement. He's also the editor of the Cornell University Press book series, Publicly Engaged Scholars, Identities, Purposes, and Practices. So with that introduction, I'm happy to welcome Dan and Scott. The time is yours. And again, just to remind our viewers, if you have questions, post them to the Q&A. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. So we're going to start off by just acknowledging that tonight we're going to center a book that has 8 voices and is really authored by 10 people. Scott and I and 8 other scholars are all, in true sense, co-authors of this. We're going to focus on one particular scholar, and we're going to celebrate him because he was unsung during his lifetime. He's still with us, getting older up at Davis, and that is Isao Fujimoto. Also, I just wanted to say that the book is coming home now, back to the Valley, the narrative of what happened here. Earlier today, we were with students at Fresno City College. Tomorrow we'll be at the College of the Sequoias and at Fresno State. We're so honored to be here. I also just wanted to acknowledge the work that's being done at Fresno State in a lot of the themes and the history of what we talk about in our book. Andy, you yourself have been so instrumental. It's been so great working with you at the Human Rights Coalition. Dashana Jayasundara, Marcus Crawford, Deborah Saxon. The Devil's Fruit is a book that everyone should read, and Deborah's actions as an activist in our community are extraordinary. She is absolutely in what Trudy Wichterman in our book calls the river. And then Andy Levine, to give a shout out to him, he's doing the work also, and as I think an adjunct faculty, bringing students out into the community. We're going to talk about Isao Fujimoto tonight. Isao believed in ordinary people working for change, and scholars were in the midst of that, and educators. I would say that what you're going to hear tonight is that Isao proposed and showed us an education based on praxis, the integration of practical application and theory. This chapter is extraordinarily personal to me. When you see the book, you'll see that Isao was absolutely a mentor of mine. Our book is based off of my doctoral dissertation. I worked under Scott at Cornell. Higher ed is hierarchical, and I was grateful for him to show me the way. Isao, a number of years before that, was an emeritus professor at UC Davis, and also kind of introduced me, especially into the idea that values are extraordinarily important to ground our work as scholars. So Scott and I are going to read a few pages from Isao's chapter, and then we're going to open it up for questions. The scope of the book is broader than we're talking about tonight. We're going to focus on undergraduate education and the politics around this. You'll see them play out, not in the history of Fresno State, which likely has this similar history that I haven't studied, but in the context of the University of California, and in particular, its flagship institution at UC Davis. So I'm going to start off by reading the introduction to Isao's chapter. The book and many of the chapters are told in the testimony of the scholars themselves, and also are revisiting the findings of their research. Isao, after he retired, gave a lecture at UC Davis called War Stories. It's the title of his chapter as well. Many of the segments you'll hear of him speaking that Scott and I will read come from that and other oral histories that Isao provided. But first, let's just start with the beginning of Isao Fujimoto's chapter. In numerous ways, I am a student of Isao Fujimoto. Both Orville Thompson and Isao were emeritus professors in my department while I studied for my master's degree in international agricultural development at UC Davis. As part of the Human and Community Development Department, the historic descendant of applied behavioral sciences, which Isao started at Davis, all of our offices were clustered together on a wing of the second floor of Hart Hall. Doors always open. I visited them often. In the decades since, I continually returned to commune with Isao when I passed through town. On each visit, he always inquisitively peppered me with questions. What was I doing? Who was I collaborating with? Isao even typed notes during these debriefs. He cared like a mentor, a father of sorts, a colleague. The organization I came to lead, the Central Valley Partnership, was explicitly named after the previous Irvine Foundation funded effort that Isao had coordinated and facilitated a decade earlier, and in which eventually was the topic of his own doctoral dissertation, which he completed after 50 years of being a movement builder here in California. When we incorporated the nonprofit, I suggested the name. Each time I hear it, I smile, remembering Isao and his previous work, which I aim to carry on. There are many weighty spirits that animate this book, but for me, Isao stands particularly tall. It is impossible to know how many others, like myself, are busy with our work in the world because of him. Isao launched 1,000 ships, and I was one of them.
So speaking of the launching of ships, just last week, I was posting on social media the events of this week. And an old friend that I hadn't heard from in a long time, his name is Mark Ritchie, responded right away to the post. He said, "Thank you for writing about Esau, my hero and mentor." Turns out Mark Ritchie was for 8 years the Secretary of State in Minnesota. He was the founder of the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, one of the most powerful and important international NGOs in the world, working on issues related to justice and the food system and food agricultural systems. Mark, I asked him, then really, he was your mentor? And he wrote me this long paragraph about how much he had been moved by him. And he closed that by saying, there are many of us folks that Esau mentored scattered across the country, and the planet is a better place because of his attention and generosity. So let's share a bit about who this man was and what he was doing. Dan gave us the introduction of how he came to be so close to Esau. There was a connection with my own institution in Esau, which will be in this passage I'm going to read you now. So we're focusing on Esau because what he did in his career at UC Davis was to develop one of the most interesting and rigorous and powerful programs that engaged undergraduate students in research in really, really creative and interesting ways, off of the campus of UC Davis, out into the Central Valley, out into the neighborhoods in San Francisco, out even beyond California. So the War Stories talk he gave is kind of a personal memoir. And I'm going to read you the opening section of that because it gives you a glimpse of how he ended up at how he ended up at UC Davis and what he did as his first move. It is said, and he opens this with a teaching, which is a foundational teaching for me in my life and for us. And we want this teaching to be remembered beyond this event that we're all participating in now. He begins by saying, it is said that if we are going to make any sense of what we are doing, we have to know what story we are in. If it makes any sense of, we're going to make any sense of what we're doing. The philosopher in the room here might recognize that that's actually a paraphrasing of Alistair MacIntyre's question in Beyond Virtue, from the book Beyond Virtue, where he raised exactly that question, but in a little different way. So Esau begins, it is said that if we're going to make any sense of what we are doing, we have to know what story we are in. I'm going to talk about stories and the story that we are all in together, because we have a lot in common. I came here and started teaching about 40 years ago in the spring of 1967. I was brought here from Cornell to help start a department from what was called agricultural education. One of my first instructions was to change some of the courses. UC Davis had been a place where people came to become agricultural teachers for vocational education in high school. But introductory courses like agricultural education were getting less and less people. We needed to turn it around. I looked around campus and I found many departments that were split. The psych department in Young Hall was split and not communicating. The first floor was bare, but the second floor had all these psychedelic drawings. I thought, maybe that is what we should teach students. What are the biases in every discipline? What are the revolutions going on? So instead of ag education, 10, the name of the course, I started a course called Scientific Bias and Social Myth. I just love that. I just love the audacity of that in a college of agriculture. Scientific bias and social myth. The course just took off. We put it in the experimental college at first. The first year we had 18 students. The second year we had 118. And the third year we had 325 students. I was also brought here to teach a rural society course. The rural society course was not in the College of Agriculture. It was in the arts and science and sociology. I had a joint appointment there. They said to boost the course enrollment. So the first year I had 11 students, second year 55, third year 125. I did that. But instead of getting credit, I started getting negative feedback. It had to do with another assignment. The department changed its name from Ag Education to Applied Behavioral Science. Then they got some money to look at farm labor. The department had never gotten this kind of money. They were going to look at the real life situation instead of the supply and demand side. I put 2 people out in the fields as workers. They went out from day hall at 4 o'clock in the morning to record everything they saw. They found out things from the point of view of the worker. How they were getting scammed. The sheriff's department arrested people, put them in jail, and then had them work for free for people. We realized that something wasn't right here, and it's not just a matter of getting at the truth.
So I'm going to continue on with Esau, but I want to do, before reading the next chapter from this same lecture, later on in that same lecture, we've titled this talk Confronting Injustice. And you can see from the end of that segment that Scott read, that Esau quickly, with sending his undergraduate students out into the fields as workers in the middle of the 1960s and 70s, very quickly they were uncovering the injustices that were in their society and that they wanted to answer. The other thing is how much Esau helped to salvage UC Davis at the time. And you'll find in other chapters in the book that there was a crisis with students simply not going to classes, blocking munitions trains going through Davis, and they were demanding relevance. And the creation of this applied behavioral sciences department with Esau as one of the first instructors ever hired shows how Esau, in many respects, salvaged UC Davis and sacrificed his own career in some ways, because he put off getting his dissertation for so long and was called upon on every single task that was difficult during those years. The university was turning to him. So Esau later, he's giving this lecture to faculty and mostly graduate students at UC Davis. And again, the title of it was War Stories. He continues later on after telling some of those war stories. If you think I am exaggerating, this is Esau, and these are not war stories, you tell me later on, but I call them war stories because I felt I was in a real battle here. One of the reasons is that this area, the Central Valley of California, is unique. The Central Valley is a very special place. It is the richest agricultural region, not just in California, not just in America, not just in the world. It is the richest agricultural region in the history of the world. The public image of the Central Valley is that of wealth in its agricultural productivity. But I would say that the wealth is really in all of the people that are here. Tremendous diversity. We don't have time to talk about the diversity, but you could go around the world and just by staying in the Central Valley, they're Hmong, Mixtec, Zapotec. Now take a look at this map. I plotted the median income of wealth of the top 50 and the bottom 50 out of the 480 cities in California. Look where 430 to 480 are. Where are the 1 to 50? Look where they are. All of the wealth is on the coast. San Francisco, the Bay Area, LA, San Diego, Orange County. And where are the poor ones? They are in the interior of California, pretty much all in the Central Valley. And the poorest ones, the bottom 5, are all in Fresno and Tulare counties. There are about 3,000 counties in the country. If you rank them all according to agricultural productivity, the top 10 are usually have almost all been in the San Joaquin Valley. Numbers 1, 2, 3 for the last 50 years has been Fresno, Tulare, and Kern County. Yet you have on the map towns like Huron and Mendota in Fresno County, the richest agricultural county in the whole country. The poorest cities in California are also there. That's called a contradiction. We have poverty and wealth in one place. This is why it's very important to really start examining these kinds of questions. Usually this work is done by rural sociologists because they raise questions about the humanistic side of an issue. I found out that there were no other rural sociologists in California at all, not just at UC Davis. The UC system has 3 ag schools, Berkeley, Riverside, and Davis, but there were no rural sociologists. I discovered that I was alone and said, why are there no other rural sociologists here?
So by the way, we are, as we get into the detail of what he's doing here, and we're almost finished with these readings. We have not shown you a picture of Isao Fujimoto, and I'm wondering how your imagination is depicting him. Let us just add a few more ingredients. His family, as Japanese Americans, were dispossessed and removed of their house and property during World War II and put in a concentration camp. They came back and were able to have another farm. But he carried with him throughout his life that experience. And one of the things Dan and I have always noted about him is that when you're with Isao, he is always laughing. So all these things that Dan has been reading, that we're reading about him, imagine him laughing as he's telling you about the depth of poverties in the Central Valley. And his laugh is it's a laugh that comes from his determination to not let these facts dismay him and derail him from his fierce commitment to do what we see him tell us that he does in his war stories. So here's another fragment of the war stories. It begins with a paragraph that sort of connects to earlier stuff, but then he begins to tell us in more detail. So how did he set up an undergraduate research program, and what did that look like? After the Wyatt debate, Alex McCalla became the dean of the College of Agriculture. He was sympathetic. He said, I'll get the money and we'll put in those positions to get the community development program going. I started bringing people together and had these courses for undergraduates. It was a 3-course series. 151 was research. I taught people how to go to any town and look at a plot of land, like a gas station, and find out who they bought it from, who they owed money to, if they had any lawsuits against them, etc. And do that without talking to anybody. You do that by going to county offices. You go to the assessor's office, the recorder's office, look at fictitious names and all that. You can find all this out. When you do this, you can start learning about ownership, power, corporate control, which was the whole purpose of that. The second course was community development, to learn how you do things. All right, what kind of things are going on? How do you solve problems? The third one was internship. Go out in the field. Don't stay in Davis. Go away for a quarter. I put people out in Appalachia. I put people out on the Navajo reservation. They struck out into the Central Valley. They did great stuff. And he's laughing. Here they are, undergraduates, doing all kinds of stuff about who owns what. Eventually, we started a graduate program here. Alex really came through. We were able to hire 3 people, Wilbur Sheen, Dean McCannell, and Miriam Wells. They came on board and we started the graduate program. Before they came, I designed courses. Here is what I did. Rather than say, here is a course on research or theory, I asked, what kinds of questions do we want people to be able to answer by the time they get out of here? These were the questions behind each of the courses. There's 5 of them. Number 1, how can I make sense of the world and explain what is going on around me? You do that by studying theory, but also learning research methodology. Good theory helps you to make sense of what's going on. Number 2, how can I get people to work together to solve problems? That is the essence of community development. Number 3, how do I find out what works? Where and how? You do that by going out in the field, by being an intern with both grass tips and grassroots. There's a big difference between those 2, as well as different agencies. Number 4, where can I contribute that draws on my particular skills, passions, and interests? Number 5, the last one, is about skills. Any work with people needs more than knowledge. It's also how to get along, how to inspire people, how to conduct meetings. The other thing was, how do you keep your sanity? You are going to be under a lot of pressure. I know a lot about that stuff after my first years here. His war stories were full of that. How do you do work that allows you to go home energized? A lot of people go home from work and they are pooped out. This is another time where you feel high.
So we're gonna finish with the last reading, but I wanted to comment on a few of those things that Scott was touching on. So Isao is sending his students out into the Central Valley to work. When they come back, these are not, there's no template and model for what he does. He is devising a methodology of engagement with his students in the middle of a social justice, civil rights movement. And what he does is he co-publishes a series of how-to guides on how to do this. Esau, we see over and over, consistently gave up power and authority, and he shared credit. In fact, the opposite of if you want to get credit and get acknowledged in higher education, this is the opposite of what you do. I think it was based on both his personality and his Japanese upbringing. These books that we won't go into depth here and we touch upon in his chapter, they had the students writing things like how to survive in a car, where to find free food. It wasn't like these are paid internships with insurance backing you up. He launched them out into the middle of the worst injustices, places that they chose to go. It was basically a bridge between what you would envision a SNCC organizer doing in Mississippi and a Peace Corps volunteer. There was resources, there was backings, but they were much more naked and exposed than we would expect of an internship today. And again, they're going into the Mississippi Delta, they're going into Appalachia, they're going into the Central Valley when things were much worse 20 or 30 years ago. So one of the pamphlets he co-wrote with his students, and I'm sure they had a say in its title, which was Getting the Straight Dope. Certainly the next cadre of students would probably want to read that book in the 1970s. This is a chapter where we start talking about how Esau crafted his teachings, and I'll read a small piece from one of those readers that he was giving out to his students. The University of California, this is Scott and I writing here. The University of California promoted Fujimoto as a lecturer, valuing him as a teacher. How did he structure and teach his courses? His ABS, community development courses, and internship were examples of his pedagogy and its purpose. These classes integrated rural sociology, community development, and adult education with applied experiential learning. It was an education based upon praxis. When Fujimoto arrived in Davis, the university asked him to get the students who were demanding relevant instruction and education from the administration back into the classrooms during the turbulent era of the late 1960s. The university relied upon Fujimoto to design curriculum and courses in response to student demands, but also to salvage the legitimacy of their institution in the eyes of their most valued customers, the students. He accomplished this task, however, at personal cost and sacrifice. The ABS course series that Fujimoto built was similar to courses that both Galarza and Villarejo taught in the 1960s and 70s at other University of California campuses. Both of those are other scholars in the book. These courses emphasize direct engagement and applied learning in community-based settings over extended periods of time. Once again, if we want to do relevant pedagogy to empower young people and change community, these courses emphasize direct engagement and applied learning in community-based settings over extended periods of time. Internship and fieldwork experiences were supported by classroom instruction in scientific social science methods and academic theory. Undergraduate students learned to be politically engaged as they directly witnessed and confronted social injustices and economic inequalities. I think I'm gonna not read the other perspectives one because we've read enough. And maybe, Andy, we could read more later, but I think we might open it up to some questions now since we've read a lot and people have a taste for Esau and what he was doing. Other scholars in our book also did education along similar lines. Ernesto Galarza used frontline workers in the middle of strikes to understand their own oppression that was happening and to try to make strategic choices on how to build a worker movement. And Don Villarejo chose to initiate the California Institute for Rural Studies outside of the University of California after the UC system's great reticence to take up these issues and to study the plight of farm workers and how the well-being of rural communities in California. So there's other examples in the book that show a pedagogy of empowerment, if you will, but Esau is the one person who's doing it within an institutional context and for undergraduate education, just as you had asked us to bring forward. So we recommend the chapter, then the book to educators and lecturers and faculty who want to look at how to do more powerful pedagogies.
So before we ask you to be provocative and look at the questions, I just want to come back to that question that he poses, his paraphrasing of the Alistair McIntyre. It is said that if we want to make sense of what we are doing, we have to know the story we are in. It's really amazing to me that Isao Fujimoto built an entire program of work over many decades just from that question. And the way he did it, which connects with the theme that this series you're doing is centered on, is not by him going to answer the question of what story we are in by himself as a scholar, but him posing that question to undergraduate students. And then increasingly, as in one of the passages I read, to his colleagues that he was able to hire on, people like Dean McCannell, who's also in the book. And that together they went to try to answer those questions. Together, they documented what they found. Together, they created new classes. Together, they created these manuals and workbooks for others who might want to learn how to do action research, as he was calling it. And he believed just incredibly, in an incredibly visionary way in all of this, that the way for us to learn about all these things is to get out into the world. You have to get into the field, as he was saying. We can't just sit on the campus. So this is a big challenge to all of us who teach in higher education, because I recognize the truth in what he teaches us and what he says. I feel the power of it. We see the power of it. When my friend Mark Ritchie, the Secretary of State in Minnesota, instantly sends me this kind of response about his hero and mentor, we feel the impact. So there's an avenue here of power that is actually a story that I feel myself to be a part of. So our question really for you in Fresno and at Fresno State is, what is the story you're in? How do you see that? What's the story of Fresno and the Central Valley today? How are you finding out what that story is? How might students be engaged as powerful researchers, not just learners in classrooms, but as co-researchers with us to pursue those kinds of questions and to move to the actions that those questions compel us to take?
Thank you, guys. There's already a couple of questions in the Q&A, and if I'll just summarize, the first question is asking, I think, what do you want? What's the takeaway from this? So let me see if I can provoke a little. You asked me to come up with a provocative question. You know, one model of education is that you tell me what I need to know, right, so that I could plug myself into the network and get a job and make some money. I mean, like, I think many students in the last 50 years, that's why a lot of kids go to college. They just want to tell me what I need to know so that I can get a job and make a buck, right? What I hear you suggesting is that this model that Esau at Davis is pioneering is not that at all. It's not. It's like, don't plug yourself into the network, but challenge the network, rethink the network. I'm using this network kind of, you know, as if there's some system that we're buying into. And so all the way back to this idea of confronting injustice through education and research. One model of research is just to figure out what's going on in the world. Another model of research is to figure that out so you could change the world and, like, you know, come up with proposals. So not just plugging yourself in, but changing things. What do you think? Am I on the right track in terms of what you're after with this with this one example and the other examples you talk about in the book?
Scott and I have boiled down the book to three themes. First, the book is an analysis, and eventually, because they didn't come in thinking that Paul Taylor and Goldschmidt didn't know what the Valley was like when they came here. A critique, eventually, of agribusiness. Secondly, the book is a critical topography. It lays out a geography over 100 years of time through the stories and findings of academics. And we do that. We lay out this map, this guide, so that people can understand where they've been, so they can understand their story and place themselves in it. And I would premise that many of the folks that are in your classes at Fresno State experience their parents going out the door each day, and maybe their grandparents to work in the fields, exposed to pesticides, and exposed to unjust treatment, to high poverty, and systemic forms of racism. This is laid out in a structural way. And Andy, I really sense that the way that our society in North America and the United States is crafted is that we blame and expect the poor to blame themselves for their own desperation and misery. This book will clearly show it's not your fault. And you and we should join together to do something about it. And finally, the book is an expression of values, in particular and foremost about democracy. And it says something about democracy that's really important. If you're going to have a democracy, it's a constituent, it's a prerequisite, condition, and a measurable outcome. If you're going to have a democracy, you need an equitable economy. An equitable economy is an outcome and a supporting mechanism of democracy. And finally, and I think Esau does this most as a value in the book, it's the power of community. It's the power of community, both communities of scholars. This book is about 4 generations and now entering into the 5th generation. We're telling you about Esau and this work because we are inviting the students and the activists and the residents of the Valley to learn their history so that they can come together and fight back and transform in positive ways the reality of their lived lives. So those are the 3 ones. It's an analysis and critique of agribusiness. It's a critical topography of the geography of this region laid out over 100 years in narrative. So narrative is stories are a much more easy way for humans to communicate knowledge, much better than statistics. And finally, this is an expression of values. So we want this book to spur on more action in the simplest way, a positive, progressive change that needs to happen in a region that I would say, and that is definitively proven in the book, that this place, our region, is structured to be oppressive, to oppress people along lines of, especially of race and class.
So there are multiple answers to the question on the table in terms of what's the take home or takeaway of the book, and the connection that you were making with the sort of mainstream approach to education and approach to college degrees and all of that. And I'll put it this way. The one way that people understand the story of the Central Valley is as a tragedy. The story is about oppression, destruction, environmental and human damage. It's a tragedy, full of oppression. That's a story. That is a story that we find ourselves in, as Esau's saying. But what this book actually really does is it reveals another story that is not only not over, but building in strength and power. This is a story filled with people like Esau, who have built an enormously powerful set of methods and approaches, organizing, pedagogy, research, to build power and to confront injustice. This is a story, we call them scholars. 4 of the 8 scholars in the book did not work for colleges and universities. They were researchers out in communities. They had advanced degrees, but they did their work on the ground independently from universities, either with a labor union or a nonprofit. So the book reveals this story, which Trudy Wisherman refers to as a river of a century of like virtual relay race of people who have joined in the struggle by choosing to bring the tools of education and research out into the community, out to the front lines. there's a beautiful passage in here that Ernesto Galarza said that captures it all in one sentence. But I'll say that when I read Mark Ritchie's response back to me that he just sent last week, here's somebody whose whole life was imprinted by the experiences he had with Esau in ways he couldn't possibly have imagined when he was a student with him. And I think what that shows us, and I think this is true, and if there are students here with us today that can speak to this, maybe they can tell us. But like in the 1960s, when there was a call for relevance, I think a lot of students, I know my students at Cornell, they hunger for something meaningful. They want work that has dignity to it. They want work that has meaning to it. They don't want their lives to be meaningless. What Esau did is he created an avenue, a program for really rich, deep meaning and significance. People were working with real issues and real people. They were learning real skills that were actually going to help them join in those struggles. And it turns out there's a legacy, as Mark Ritchie was saying, of people who are forever grateful of this man, because what he did was he gave them the tools and the inspiration that enabled them to have a whole life of meaning in the work that they've been able to find. So I think this doesn't mean that all the other kind of education is wrong or necessarily bad. It's just that if we don't have this ingredient, we're missing something very powerful. And it's the only way you can really know some things is through the kind of thing that Esau was doing. You can't know the things that students were learning by sitting on a campus. You have to be out there.
Let me go to Allie's question now. Allie asked two questions. The second one Allie's asking is about these stories. We're kind of born into these, like the stories, we find ourselves thrown into them. I think, kind of philosophy, like we're thrown into the world. But Allie's first question is asking, what's the difference between the story of a place like Fresno or a place like the Central Valley and the story of San Francisco? And I mean, literally she says, why did he choose the Central Valley? Was it because of our agricultural history, our diversity, our immigrant story? And I'm maybe just push this a little bit further. The narratives that we find ourselves in, both regionally, nationally, often overlook places like Fresno, right? Like the narrative, like California, it's 49ers, and that's our football team in San Francisco. And who cares about what happens up and down the 99, right? Who cares what happens over here? Is there something here about reclaiming narratives that are forgotten or overlooked? And then maybe back to UC Davis and Fresno State, our nexus here, like, is our job to sort of reclaim those narratives that, tell our own stories? What do you think about that?
I'm so tempted to go find this portion in Janaki Jagannath's chapter. Janaki's chapter is named Cultivate Diversity. And Janaki was in the International Agricultural Development Program at UC Davis. She went in just after me, I think, when I was getting my master's there in the same department or field. In her chapter, she mentions the enormous and powerful impact that Esau had on her. And yet the story that I often tell, and Scott is kind of probably needling me a little bit, is focused on the inequality and oppression and injustice. Esau didn't front those, and neither did Janaki. What drew Esau Fujimoto to the Central Valley was, yes, the paradox of poverty and wealth, but more than that was the extreme, extraordinary diversity of peoples here that he felt was the essence of what was needed to solve any problem. So the chapter that we title of Janaki's chapter is called Cultivate Diversity. This fits both in agricultural systems. You do not want a monocrop. Coming from an Irish background where they were farming one or two kinds of potatoes, a blight can hit you. The same kind of diversity, cultivate diversity. We want diversity in our communities, our problem solving. We want rich, diverse, and stable and secure community. So Janaki and Esau, coming from immigrant heritages, both of whom had experienced themselves a lot of prejudice, are inviting us into multiracial community to celebrate our own well-being and to enable it. So this history of the Valley that's fronted, that can be measured in statistics of air pollution or death rates or poverty rates, and those are very important statistics. I think that when you see the book and you read Esau's chapter and Janeki's chapter, it's a positive story. The Valley is the place of hope. And so often, Andy, the Valley has an inferiority complex in some ways. And then at the same time, an extraordinary pride. And this is the kind of pride we need to tap into to finally solve these endemic structural problems and and I'm really hopeful that in the next 10 to 15 years, we're going to get there. But so I'm not sure if that got there, and I'll pass it to Scott.
I'll say that this question about stories and storytelling is what I do every day. Stories are very dangerous things for what they conceal. One of the things people have said about stories who study them is that storytelling is primarily an act of erasure. Because when we tell a story about what happened today, you go home from work and your significant other or whoever asks you, so what happened today? You erase 99% of what happened when you answer that question, because you couldn't possibly say everything that happened. And so as human beings, we make decisions about what we include in stories and not. Part of finding out, as Esau is saying, what story we're in, is finding out what are the stories people are telling, and what damage are those stories doing, and what are those stories leaving out, and how are they misleading and deceiving. But most importantly, I'll use my favorite single sentence about stories to point to this. It's by a psychology scholar and narrative named Arthur Frank. He wrote a book called Letting Stories Breathe. The sentence is, people are like actors cast into multiple scripts that are all unfinished. So we are all participants in somebody's script, somebody's story. You are scripted as student. So here's what you do as student. Here's your script. I'm scripted as professor. Here's what I do as professor. Here's my script. But as Frank is pointing to, these are unfinished scripts. The next scene's not written yet. And we could change the story. We could tell a different story. We could change the roles by telling the story. That's what Esau's story is about. He went into UC Davis and he changed the roles. He went against the dominant paradigm of what a professor is supposed to do and what a student's supposed to do. And that opened up a whole new world. And new stories came from that. New stories that included the things that you were mentioning that are sometimes neglected, left out, bracketed out of the dominant stories that we get in the media and from powerful players.
I just found, Andy, I want to read 2 chapters from Janeki talking about Esau.
2 sentences.
2 paragraphs.
You said chapters.
One of those.
Yeah.
Esau was a major influence, though. His legacy of intercultural, look at how she views Fresno in these sections. Esau's legacy of intercultural movement building in the Valley, that was the thing that really drove me into wanting to do the work in the region. Layers of immigration stories that have resulted in this incredible confluence of cultures. I wanted so much to experience it. If you ask me what period in time I want to go back to witness, it's the early 1900s in Fresno's Chinatown. Can you imagine? Even today, when you go down there, there's Central Fish with the fish smells and the masjid calling prayers. Chinese herbal markets are open and the Oaxacan bakery is right there too. And you wonder, what world am I in right now? All these people here and all together. That's the stuff that really set me off. I wanted so much to experience that when I first moved to Fresno. Thanks so much to Esau's writings. My curiosity was so sparked by the things that he had written, the weaving of intercultural movement as a response to industrial agriculture. I was doing independent research, reading everything that he had written. Esau, teaching a student, even as he's an emeritus professor when she's in front of him in these years. And look at the seeds that are planted in me, in Mark Ritchie, in Jonike. And again, ESAL launched 1,000 ships, the Davis Farmers Market, the Davis Food Co-op, the bike lanes in Davis, Eco Farm. Those were all outgrowths of ESAL and his students.
Let me jump in. Thank you. I just want to direct our audience attention to the chat, where my colleague Matt Gendian is drawing our attention to the fact that the School of Social Sciences, College of Social Sciences here at Fresno State is doing some of these things connected to this kind of engaged research and experiential learning. And Matt Gendian, thank you for putting that in the chat. Please, everyone, take a look. He's talking about, for example, this new idea of a Center for Community Voices, which kind of sounds similar to what was going on in Davis back in the day.
Matt might have joined late, but at the beginning, Matt, we mentioned you and the wonderful work you and others are doing at Fresno State.
So here's a question for you then, and it's connected to some in the Q&A. Aaron is asking, what's better or worse, or what's, where should we look for inspiration or whatever? Is something changed from the 60s to today? And so what I'd like to invite you for the last 5 or so minutes, we have about 7 or 8 minutes left. What's next? So let's imagine we're on board with this, right? Like do some engaged pedagogy. We need to be out in the field, as you say, or as Isao says. What should happen on college campuses like Fresno State? What's the agenda that comes out of this?
I think first of all, pedagogically, in how we teach and how we do research, is to close the distance between the problems we want to describe and the solutions we want to offer. David Greenwood, an anthropologist, retired now from Cornell, once critiqued this Research One, which is Davis and Berkeley and Stanford and the Ivies, this Research One university and the work that they do. He said that he critiqued these scholars that sit away from the problem as the knowledge they're producing could be viewed as speculation or conjecture because it's too far from the problem. And Andy, I would say that we're in a moment where human beings are a social animal. We're in a moment when we know our own extinction is before us. Maybe not in our own generation, but certainly our grandchildren will be looking at extinction as a possibility. Already we're in the Anthropocene with much of that going on. We need to come together to problem solve in nonviolent ways using what is scholarship, using knowledge, using stories, using these different methodologies to problem solve, to come together around those proposed solutions. It's aching to see that our society is at a moment when we have a hard time articulating and agreeing upon shared knowledge, even in the midst of a pandemic, whether we're going to do the simple, polite act of wearing a mask. Everything's politicized to an nth degree. We need to be coming together at this moment, not dividing along these lines of positive solution. And I do think that it comes back to communities of scholars, and that does not mean you have a master's degree or a PhD. Antonio Gramsci in the 1920s did not have those degrees and was facing off against Franco in fascist Italy, perfectly fine, bringing community together in civic ways. We need scholars both in the academy and outside. And just for a university like Fresno State, closing the distance between the problems that are right outside our doors and the institutions that are publicly funded, especially.
Since I am a professor at a university, I think about this question you're posing every day. And I don't think there's a single answer to the question. I think there are many answers, and what Dan just said is at the center. But here's one thing I would add that I have tried to practice as a principal, and I was mentored into this by people that I admire very much. When students show up on a college campus, we have to really see them and try to understand who they are. What are they aspiring to do and be in their lives? What are the questions they have? What are the commitments that they feel in their bones? What are the doubts they have? We really need to make space and room for doing that. And that means basically we have to humanize the whole project of education certainly more than it is at an institution like mine, where students can go through their whole experience and then no one has really ever even seen them or know who they are. When graduate students show up to me to work with me, when undergraduates show up, I want them to be human beings who can express their dreams and their desires, and to connect those to their families and how they grew up, because they bring the world into our institutions through the stories of their families. And even at a place like Cornell University, I do story circles with my students. Everything you can imagine is being brought right into my classroom from these undergraduate students that I have at Cornell University. And all of the struggles, all of the issues, up and down any list you could make. So I think that's a really important thing we start with. And if we do that, instead of throwing buckets of cold water on students' idealism and students' aspirations for meaningful lives and their hopes, we can perhaps not only help them strengthen and temper those dreams and aspirations, but we can, through engaging them in the kind of work that Esau showed us and that many people are doing today, including at your institution at Fresno State, maybe we can join them in the project of doing research that might matter for the people in the world that are struggling with what they're struggling with and dreaming what they're dreaming.
You know, you're making me think, from where I come from on our campus, there's a place in all of this for the humanities, for
Absolutely.
art,
Yes,
and literature. Do you want to just say a word about that? I heard you going in that direction.
I co-directed this national consortium called Imagining America. It was founded in 1999 out of a White House Millennial Council that was actually chaired by Hillary Clinton. It was the only higher education component. It spent its first decade at Syracuse University, at University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, another decade at Syracuse, and now it's at UC Davis. We shepherded the moving of the office there. And it originated by people in the arts and humanities feeling and knowing that we have a lot of things of great power to bring to the work of understanding today's problems and of creatively dreaming and enacting solutions to them. People in design fields, people in history, people in literatures. There's a whole range of philosophy. There's a whole range of fields in the humanities, and I situate myself in history in the humanities field. That are absolutely indispensable to the kind of problem solving, problem understanding that we need to be engaged in the world. And they have too long been away from that table. We build all these engaged learning centers, service learning centers, and where's the humanities? Where's the arts? We have social science, we have some biology people and some engineering people, but where's the humanities? So Imagine America emboldened. It was born because bold people in those fields went to that conference at the White House, founded this organization, and it is a continuous call to artists, scholars in the arts and humanities, not only employed by universities, but in community arts organizations all across the country. I could tell you story after story about the powerful people out there in the world who are at the front lines, and through their art and their humanities-based methodologies and ways of being, they are building knowledge and communicating it powerfully through theater pieces, through dance pieces, through all kinds of visual arts as well. So this is an ingredient that, again, I think students hunger for this. We as faculty members hunger for this because it's an avenue of meaning and significance and power.
You're inspiring me, getting me excited about this. So I thank you for that comment at the end there. Let me just bring our time to a close at 6 o'clock. I know everybody's busy, and our panelists today are here in the Central Valley. Tomorrow they're speaking at College of the Sequoias. Is that right?
7 p.m. Ponderosa Hall, I think.
And Scott's been visiting us, so thank you for making the trip all the way out here to Central California. And thank you to our participants and the Q&A. I know there's still some questions in the Q&A that we didn't get to, but just thank you to everybody who showed up. And if you want to watch, we made a recording of this. It'll go on our YouTube channel in a day or so. So thank you to everybody. Thank you for joining us. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.